What would you do if the woman who had given everything she had to stand beside you was left crying in the middle of a ruined market stall, and the only way to prove your love was not with words, but with the way you rushed back to protect her when the world turned cruel? That morning had begun so quietly that no one could have guessed how violently it would break. In a small kitchen, warmed by the smell of chicken porridge, Tu Tien moved with the tenderness of a woman who had learned to pour love into ordinary things. CEO Jack ate in peace, then stepped out into the day to meet another businessman, leaving behind a house filled with soft light and the kind of fragile happiness that only poor people truly know how to treasure. But before the sun reached its highest point, the market would become a place of fear. A basket of carefully picked oranges would be crushed under the boots of men without mercy, and Tu Tien would find herself calling the man she loved with a voice broken by terror. What followed was not just rescue. It was the quiet revelation that real love is not measured by what two people say to each other in comfort, but by what they do when one of them is humiliated, threatened, and left trembling in the dust. The morning had opened like a promise. Sunlight drifted gently through the window of the little kitchen, touching the worn table, the stacked bowls, the steam rising from the pot, and Tu Tien's face as she stood over the stove. The space was modest, but nothing in it felt lacking. The house held the warmth of a life built carefully, with effort and tenderness rather than wealth. The smell of chicken porridge moved through the room in slow waves, comforting and familiar. It was the kind of scent that makes a house feel safe before the day has had the chance to test it. Tu Tien ladled the porridge into a bowl with quiet concentration, then placed it in front of Jack with both hands, her eyes full of the kind of affection that does not need decoration. She did not speak much. She did not need to. Care had already spoken through the meal itself. Jack sat down and ate slowly, savoring the softness of the rice, the sweetness of the chicken, the little touches that told him she had thought about him before she thought about herself. There was something almost sacred about those simple domestic moments. Two people, one small table, a hot breakfast, and the unspoken relief of having made it to another morning together. Jack looked at her more than once while he ate. It was never only about the porridge. It was about the life behind it, the effort, the waiting, the love folded into work so ordinary that outsiders might miss its value entirely. He wiped his mouth when he had finished, stood up, and gave her the soft kind of smile that belongs to a man already carrying responsibility before he even steps outside. The day still expected things from him: business, meetings, decisions, the constant pressure of being someone others depended on. Yet for one brief moment, while he stood in that kitchen and looked at Tu Tien, he was simply a man grateful to be loved. Then he left. He had arranged to meet CEO Deng, and the conversation waiting for him belonged to another world: land, retirement, plans for the future. Deng wanted something peaceful, a quiet piece of land, away from the noise, where old age could finally breathe. Jack listened attentively, nodding with the seriousness of someone who knew that behind such requests there was often more than money. There was fatigue, there was longing, there was the desire to spend the last part of life somewhere gentler than the years that had come before it. He responded thoughtfully, promising to help, the way he always did when others turned to him. His eyes carried that familiar determination, the look of a man who had become used to solving problems, making arrangements, standing in the middle of practical matters with steady hands. When the meeting ended, he continued on with the rest of his work, unaware that while he was handling business, the fragile piece he had left behind at home was slowly moving toward a very different kind of test. Back at the farm, Tu Tien had gone into the garden. The morning there felt brighter, almost playful. Leaves shimmered in the sunlight. The orange trees were full, their fruit hanging heavy and golden against the green. Tu Tien moved quietly among them, her basket at her side, her hands touching each fruit with care before picking it. Now and then, she smiled to herself, There was something deeply satisfying in labor you can see, touch, and carry home. She bit into one ripe orange to test its sweetness, and the juice spread across her tongue with the clean taste of sunlight and patience. It made her laugh softly under her breath, a laugh no one heard. In her mind, the calculation was simple and full of hope. These oranges would sell well. A good day at the market could mean a little more ease, a little more contribution, a little more dignity in a life where every small amount mattered. She gathered them carefully, selecting the best ones, filling the basket as if she were gathering not just fruit but possibility. By the time she carried them back inside, her mood had lightened even more. She washed each orange under cool water, wiped them dry, and arranged them with the pride of someone who had worked for what she was about to offer the world. There is a very particular kind of happiness in honest labor. It does not flash. It does not boast. It rises quietly in the chest when effort turns into something real. Tu Tien felt that happiness as she stepped onto the road toward the market, the basket balanced, her heart fuller than her pockets. The market was alive by the time she arrived. Voices overlapped, buyers bargained, motorbikes passed, laughter rose from one corner while, somewhere else, someone called out prices with a rhythm so practiced it sounded almost like singing. Tu Tien found a place, set down her basket, and began arranging the oranges into neat rows. Their color alone drew attention. They glowed warmly under the daylight, bright and inviting against the roughness of the stall. She stood behind them with a shy but steady confidence, greeting customers, answering questions, and introducing the fruit in a gentle voice. For a while, the day held. Each orange sold felt like a small victory. Not because the amount was large, but because every sale affirmed something larger about her life. That she could work, contribute, stand on her own feet, and bring something good into the home she shared with Jack. The market, with all its noise and movement, felt almost joyful around her. Sunlight filtered through nearby branches and touched her face as if blessing the effort itself. It was the kind of scene that makes people believe the day will remain kind. But kindness, as this story understands too well, rarely warns before it leaves. The first sign was the noise, not the ordinary noise of commerce, but a rougher intrusion goods, voices too loud, the sharp energy of men arriving not to buy, but to dominate. Before Tu Tien could fully understand what was happening, a group of thugs had pushed through the space around her stall. Their bodies moved with the blunt confidence of people accustomed to frightening others for profit. Their faces held no softness, only entitlement. They demanded protection money. The words landed hard and fast, stripped of any pretense. Tu Tien tried to respond, tried to explain, but fear was already tightening around her throat. She had nothing to give them. She had handed all her savings over to Jack earlier, trusting him and the life they were building together, never imagining she would need cash to defend herself against men like this. When she told them she had no money, the mood changed instantly from threat to punishment. One of them kicked the stall. Another shoved the basket. The oranges tumbled and rolled across the ground in flashing streaks of gold, only to be crushed under hard shoes before they could settle. Wood cracked. The structure of the stall tipped and slammed sideways. The sound seemed much louder than it should have been, because it was not only the sound of materials breaking, it was the sound of effort being erased in seconds. Tu Tien stared for a moment as if her mind could not catch up to the destruction happening in front of her. Then the terror arrived all at once. She tried again to speak, to plead, to ask them to stop, but her voice broke under the weight of panic. Tears came before she could hold them back. Everything she had carefully washed, arranged, and carried with hope had been turned into ruin. The market that had felt lively a moment earlier now seemed merciless, full of watching eyes and nowhere safe to stand. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone. When she called Jack, the sound of her own voice startled her. It came out fragmented, sobbing, almost unrecognizable. All the morning's quiet joy vanished in that instant. What remained was fear, helplessness, and the crushing humiliation of being attacked while simply trying to work. When Jack saw her name on his phone and heard the terror in her voice, something inside him dropped at once. There are moments when a person does not need the full story. Tone is enough. Breathing is enough. The broken edges of a loved one's voice are enough. He did not waste time asking more than necessary. He moved immediately, leaving everything else behind. The road back to her felt longer than it should have. Every second stretched under the pressure of imagining what he would find. By the time he reached the market, the damage had already been done. The stall was in pieces. Oranges lay burst open or scattered into dirt. People had drawn back the way crowds always do after violence close enough to witness, far enough to avoid involvement. And there, in the center of the wreckage, stood Tu Tien with tears on her face, her whole body still trembling from fear she had not yet escaped. Jack stepped forward with a calmness that did not come from peace, but from control forged under pressure. He faced the men directly. His voice was low and authoritative, the kind that carries more force because it does not need to shout. He called the police immediately and made it clear that the matter would not be buried under fear or compromise. The thugs, who had expected an easy display of dominance, suddenly found themselves confronted by something firmer than panic. When the police arrived, the balance shifted fully. The men who had barged in with such force were subdued and taken away. Only then did Jack turn fully back to Tu Tien. His expression changed at once. The hardness he had used to confront danger softened into something gentler and more painful. He told her it was all right now, that she was safe, that none of this was her fault. The words were simple, but what mattered more was the way he stayed beside her as he spoke them, as if his physical presence itself were part of the reassurance. Then he bent down and began cleaning up the ruined stall with her. That detail matters more than it seems. He did not simply rescue her and stand tall. He knelt, he gathered oranges, he lifted broken pieces, he helped salvage what remained. Love, in that moment, was not heroic in the dramatic sense. It was practical, steady, humble. He stayed with her through the ugliness of the aftermath, and little by little, the terror in her chest began to loosen. When he stood beside her to help sell the few oranges they could still save, his warm smile returned in quiet fragments, not because the day had become good again, but because he wanted her to feel that what had happened would not define her. The afternoon softened after that. Back home, he kept speaking to her in the same calm voice, reminding her that she had done nothing wrong, that fear was natural, that she did not have to carry shame for what those men had done. As he spoke, Tu Tien's breathing steadied. Her eyes were still swollen from crying, but the panic had begun to drain away. In its place came something more fragile and more sustainable: relief. Together they stepped into the kitchen. It was the same kitchen from morning, yet the day had transformed it. Now it became a place of restoration. One of them sliced meat carefully while the other stood over the stove, stirring, frying, building a meal out of the remains of an ugly day. The smell of cooking rose through the room and brought with it an almost unbelievable feeling of normalcy. The conversation between them came in small waves, light, warm, unforced. Every shared movement seemed to undo another thread of the fear that had wrapped around them earlier. By the time the food was ready, the market scene had begun to feel farther away, not forgotten, but no longer ruling the room. After the meal, they cleaned together. One washed, the other dried. Water ran cool over dishes and hands. The late sun slipped through the window and laid a soft gold across the walls. It was in those quiet, almost invisible moments that their closeness deepened most. not in the dramatic rescue itself, but in what came after, in the easy cooperation, the exchanged looks, the smiles that returned carefully, as if testing whether peace was safe again. The day had not gone the way either of them had imagined. It had begun with porridge and fruit, and hopes small enough to fit into a basket. It had become fear, violence, humiliation, and shaking hands, and yet it ended not in bitterness, but in a home slowly made warm again by two people who refused to let cruelty become the final language of the day. Jack looked at Tu Tien more than once as they finished tidying the kitchen. There was gratitude in his gaze, but also something heavier and quieter. He had seen her frightened. He had seen her try to stand alone in front of violence she should never have had to face, and that image had altered him. He understood now, even more deeply than before, that loving her meant more than sharing meals and laughter. It meant protecting the fragile things she worked for. It meant standing between her and the world when the world turned brutal. It meant answering fear with presence. Tu Tien, for her part, had also changed a little that day. Not into someone harder, but into someone who had seen the measure of the man beside her more clearly. He had not dismissed her fear. He had not been angry at her helplessness. He had not told her to stop crying and move on. He had come. He had stood up for her. He had cleaned beside her. He had stayed until calm returned. In lives like theirs, such actions carry more meaning than extravagant declarations ever could. By the time evening settled around the house, the two of them were no longer simply ending a difficult day. They were reclaiming it. And maybe that is the emotional truth this story leaves behind. Real love is not tested when the morning is gentle and the porridge is warm and the oranges shine beautifully in the basket. It is tested when men crash into your labor and try to crush your dignity under their boots. It is tested when one person trembles and the other must decide whether to remain calm enough to become shelter. Tu Tien's fear that day was real. Jack's protection was real too. And what made the ending beautiful was not that trouble disappeared, but that after the worst had passed, they still found their way back to the kitchen, to the dishes, to the quiet work of loving each other in ordinary light.